My name is Troy Michie. I'm from El Paso, Texas, and I'm based in New York City. So the materials in the work, they are sourced from a variety of sources. The first being the magazine, and that's something that I've always been drawn to just as a child, and having an access to pop culture through a magazine kind of in the beginning of the internet age. But particularly I was drawn to these niche men's magazines, just thinking of that whole history when it was illegal to show male nudity. So I sourced those magazines because they're kind of like fetish objects. So primarily from the 70s or 80s, a lot of these white photographers that fetishize men of color had these exclusively black magazines. Some of them have offensive titles. Others are kind of interesting in that they have poetry, um, they have images from the peers. So thinking a little bit of artists that had worked around that time, like Alvin Baltrap or Gordon Matta Clark. So I do use the magazine material. I also paint paper as just a palette to use, and then I collect objects. And just because I'm thinking a lot about the suits, I also have just cut up garments. So in El Paso, the nickname of El Paso is El Chuco, which kind of had this, I guess it's kind of like the precursor to the Pachuco movement, which those were the ones mainly wearing the zoot suit. But the more I researched the garment, it was really interesting in that it was the first American suit, primarily worn by men of color, but also women were also wearing the suit because at the time in the Second War, the men were away and women were working factory jobs. So it became this garment that was utilized for the style, but also the Pachucos and also African American men and Filipino men were utilizing it as this form of style, but they were mainly first generation. So the parents weren't happy about the garment because they wanted them to assimilate. And it's like you're drawing attention to yourself by wearing the baggier pants and all of this stuff. So it just became an interesting point of research in that it was covering gender, class, sexuality, and it was also illegal because of World War II rationing. So thinking about the suit, I had never really thought much about making clothing or patterning. And when I ordered patterns, I realized that our garments are pretty much collages that we have the patterns, the instructions, and then we bring them together. I was drawn to collage from what I consider to be just the area where I grew up. So growing up on the border in El Paso, everything was an amalgamation. There was no kind of, I mean, there was the border kind of isolating Mexico and America, but as being trained as an oil painter, I would always have to do something else to the paintings. I couldn't just strictly use paint as a material. And once I realized that collage was an art form that I could solely just utilize in my practice, I was drawn to the history. I think I started researching a lot, mainly like the surrealists, like Dadaists, and it seemed to be a medium that always resurfaced during times of political upheaval, and just what it means to take kind of an already existing, I mean, in this case, like I don't know, a printed image, and then reappropriate that. So just basically changing the narrative of mass media, and that's what I'm most drawn to from that history of collage.
I'm Elliott Jerome Brown Jr., and I'm from Long Island, New York, raised in the suburbs. And I currently live in Queens, New York. I would say that fundamentally what I'm interested in is others' privacy. And by that, I don't mean an investigation into it and what I can reveal that might otherwise be undisclosed to a like strange public. But by that, I mean what's possible when you don't make certain information available in the photograph, and how you can develop a variety of narratives around a setting or an individual when you kind of insist on some other reading of reality. So most of the photographic work that I make is based in real time or is improvised with the help of friends or people that I have some degree of intimacy with. So there is a certain reality or a certain lived experience to the photographs, but for the most part, they exist in this ambiguous, amorphous way where the events or the individuals in them can be fictionalized or pontificated on in any number of ways. Photography is largely understood from an idea of truth or this idea of essence and kind of uncovering that essence. Like many of the most notable photographers in its history have been portrait photographers who are eager to kind of make something of someone that no one else can reveal. And, that very well may be true that they have actually accomplished that. But as we should understand, all of that is subjective, and I think most of the times a portrait of another person ends up being a portrait of the artist themselves. So I think where I'm interested in portraiture is in a kind of a denial of essence, or not denial of essence, but just kind of more of a disregard for essence. So, and then when I think about how portraiture has been taken up by Black practitioners of the medium, both professional and hobbyist, how the resulting images have been used or kind of been in a way to affirm humanity or kind of teach someone outside of this skin what it might be to exist in this body, and how to humanize that existence. And I think those kinds of photographs are necessary, but there's quite a lot of them, and I think it allows me to make photographs in this other way that is not about truth at all, or is not about it's not about a certain kind of realism or evidence of humanity. It's more of a poetics that kind of illustrates a breadth of concerns. The kind of heightened, or maybe the juxtaposition between like theater and lived experience in the images comes from uh, the lighting first. All of the photographs are lit to kind of exacerbate the lighting that already exists, or just make the lighting that already exists feel slightly more special. But then in terms of the gestures in the photographs, like what we see in Devin and Red Sox, I don't often direct a person within the photograph. I kind of allow myself to be meticulously observant of my time with another person, so that should they do something, I can ask them to pause within it. And that gesture was the result of this person coming out of the shower and kind of placing the towel behind their back, and it like swooshed like a cape, and for a moment they disappeared, but I could still see the extremities of their body. And I was like, oh, we gotta make this. So the pose ends up being a combination of an observation, but also me asking this person to re-demonstrate the gesture for the sake of making the image. And maybe that lasts for over the 10 to 20 minutes of time, and kind of moving in between things, looking at things that I wanted to puncture. The hole in his sock was something that I just wanted to be yet another element that you could kind of chew on. Like, here's a disturbance within the photograph, whereas if the hole was knitted through and it wasn't a hole, perhaps it wouldn't be a detail to observe, or it would just be a red sock. But now it's a red sock with a hole in it that I think draws more attention to it. And then the title of it is Devin and Red Sox. So there's that too. I think objecthood or creating a structure for something to exist in suggests a greater intention than what a traditional frame would offer. And I like I also think that objects encourage a tactility. Like even the sculpture that we've included in the show, that sculpture is not something that you can touch, but I think a lot of the objects have a sense of touch. The jewelry box is something that you could otherwise use in your home. The glass cube that appears at the top could be used in like a shower setup or on the side of a building or whatnot. So they all kind of, I think, call to mind experience with the hand, and therefore also call to mind an experience of use. And I think, yeah, I'm really sensitive to the fact that I want to see how something is actually functioning and what is the animated quality of a material. A lot of my visual sensibilities, I think, are inspired by the way my grandparents, both sides, have taken care of their spaces, and they've taken care of them in incredibly different ways. My maternal grandparents are just incredibly meticulous about design, where things are appointed. There used to be a space in the house that no one was able to access unless it was a holiday, whereas my paternal grandparents existed in with a greater degree of chaos. There was mail all over the place, boxes that were unopened that came, like just a bunch of like products like being ordered. But that also excited me, that space, just kind of like seeing the space open up and seeing the way that they felt most comfortable living, or maybe not the way that they felt most comfortable, but what ended up happening. So I think inherently I just feel space, and that results in some of the more structural pieces that I'm making.
My name is Aria Dean. I'm based in New York and Los Angeles. I work across video, sculpture, and text. Over the last few years, I've gotten really interested in, I guess, kind of trying to inquire into sort of like alternatives to like proper Western formulations of subjectivity, sort of through Black radical thought. So I think in large part, a lot of the work that I've been making has sort of looked at Blackness as a sort of like alternative formulation of subjecthood in the Western world by necessity, in a sense, and looking at like how can one make objects that in some way like reference or like parallel that kind of dynamic. So even like the work that's in the show, the little mirrored man, sort of like I was interested in starting to try to model or draw on the sort of structures of Black subjectivity without necessarily falling back on like cultural signifiers related to Blackness. So I'm just sort of, I suppose, like interested in, yeah, like kind of a structural and sometimes material or materially oriented approach to those things. But largely, I think it's kind of been about like digging into, in writing, in sculpture, in video, different sort of formulations of subjecthood. And I guess sort of also like how each of those mediums has historically, like marked or tracked like the way that we've thought about subjects. The works in the show, I sort of interestingly drop in on moments throughout the entirety of my like art career, I suppose. The photographic work was made in 2017, video was later that year, and then the sculpture is much more recent. And I think that like they sort of, seeing them in the spaces all together, I think that they create a sort of interesting map, I guess, of my concerns in a way. I think that the photo work and the video work most directly relate to one another, and that they sort of center around this river in Mississippi called the Yazoo River that is near the town where my grandfather grew up, Yazoo City, Mississippi, which I'd never been to, and he left when he was 17 because he was like looked at a white woman and they were like, you have to get out of town. And I got really interested. I mean, it always been, the story of him leaving that town had always been part of like just the sort of like off the cuff, like kind of throwaway family history, just like moments in family history. But I kind of like, for whatever reason in 2017 started researching the like locale more and discovered that there was sort of this like swirl of kind of like Southern Gothic like folklore around the river, and also just like actual history that was like quite interesting in terms of the Civil War and then Reconstruction era. So like the first thing was that the river, apparently, like supposedly in the language of the tribe that originally inhabited that region of Mississippi, the river was called, the Yazoo meant death in that language, and so I got really interested in that. I also been reading a lot of stuff around like just like necropolitics and also like just like like very like Mark Fisher and like Thanatos, just kind of like a lot of stuff around like death as this force. And so I kind of became obsessed with the river at that point, and I found this woman via Facebook. Like I just put out like a call, like, hey, like anyone know someone in this area who could take some footage of this river, just even as a test to sort of see what it looked like on the ground, because I was on like Google Maps like circling it, and found this woman who was the same age as me, who was a journalist in the area, a young Black woman, and we started emailing, and I basically commissioned her to take footage of the river from like 3 different locations. And I told her, like, however you want to do it, like, just need like a wide shot, a middle shot, and a close-up shot of the river. But other than that, like, you have a creative license to do whatever. And we drew up a contract that said that if whatever work resulted from that particular, like, use of that footage, that we would then be credited as equal collaborators in the making of that work. So yeah, so I think it also coincided with a lot of interest in thinking about like Black subjectivity as well, in terms of like how do I as one Black subject relate to another. Like, and so the photos are me and her with like the faces blurred out, and so yeah, kind of just like making us interchangeable in a way. A friend and I were just talking about like refusal as a word, and like how it's so interesting because in the US it feels like it's sort of been drained of the potency that it had potentially, like where like refusal was like a actual real gesture, and now it's like if you like turn your shoulder slightly away, that's like refusal in the in America, in the art world, and like there's not. And it's this show I think is really exciting because it really is like looking at like those strategies in a way, and like trying to really ask questions about that, because I think like when I do play with the audience, it just like sometimes it's just like, oh yeah, like you're mad and you're refusing this thing, and it's like, no, I'm really trying to like get in the middle of something.
My name is Arcmanoro Niles. I'm a figurative painter. I make a lot of, paintings about my life, my friends, my family, and sort of like different scenes. A lot of the scenes are like different moments from my life, things I've been through, or like things that I've seen or stories people have told me about. A lot of the images some are made from childhood like photos. I like go through the family photo album and pick stuff, or like some are like photos that like I've taken myself, so like go back and like recreated situations. But so sometimes they are from my childhood, but sometimes they're from like maybe a year or 2 ago, just from like my process moves slow. So the paintings are made out of oil, acrylic, and like a little bit of glitter, and they're done in layers. And so like the first layer is done in acrylic. Like I'll do like a ground, so like one color, and like in these paintings is like this bright orange I use. I'm really thinking a lot about how the like the sort of the light will reflect off of it, and so like the acrylic's a little more like opaque and matte versus like the oil paint, which I use for the skin, that allows it to like glow because I painted transparently, and so in like thin layers. And so the light will like go through like each layer, then back to your eye, and so that sort of gives it the glow. And then when you get to the glitter, that's like a different way that sort of like light will bounce back and like shine. And so I'm always like thinking about like how the sort of your eye will move around the painting, but like also like how like the image sort of like moves like outward towards you as well. And I guess like the color that I used like sort of came about by accident. So when I did start painting, like I always sort of like felt like, I don't know, there was like a lot of like color and stuff like in my flesh, or like my mom's or like darker skin tones that I wasn't getting, and so for a while I actually just stopped like painting, and I would just like, also like I just felt like I didn't know how to draw. And so I like didn't paint at all. and I would just like draw and sort of like figure out how to like draw people and stuff like that. But then when I did start painting, like instead of using like black and white, I would use like purple and white. and then I like moved into like, you know, trying to use like naturalistic color or whatever, but it always felt like it was like all these colors I was missing, you know? And so something happened when I was like outside of grad school. I didn't know if it was like the photo I had or something, but it looked very orange. And so I was like, oh, how about I like start with color, like make it brighter than it needs to be. And then if I need to like tone it down, then I'll do that. And then I'll like add the like neutral colors afterwards. But when I got done with it, I realized I didn't really need it. And I can just use like these colors that I was always interested in to make the painting, and then like, and just like try to work with those, you know? So these paintings that are in the show are from 2016, and there was a group of paintings where I did about my neighborhood I grew up in, and it was sort of, I wanted to be like a tour of the area, and I wanted you to feel like you were like walking through these different spaces and sort of like encountering, I don't know, people that live there. And so, like in the paintings, there's these like creatures, I guess. I've been calling seekers, you know, and I wanted to have like give like this physical form to these like impulsive things I felt like I want to have these like impulsive creatures in the environment, sort of like influencing the other characters. And so I just wanted to like give a physical form to these things that I felt sort of like influence like my decisions or like my mom's and my friends, and just have them be like kind of cute and like playful. And I just wanted them to be like very sort of like opposite of the more, I guess, like normal looking figures, where I felt like I wanted them to be like interacting with each other or the viewer, and like have the other like creatures be like not doing that, and just like doing whatever's gonna like make them happy in the moment. Those little seekers, those little other characters in the paintings came from this sculpture that was at the Brooklyn Museum, this sort of like Egyptian fertility sculpture that I like put in this painting that I did of like me on the floor. Like I kind of looked like I was dead. I was dead. And I just sort of like, I think at the time I was thinking about like the contrast of like this guy on the floor and then like these people up front having a party, but also like thinking about like beginnings and endings and stuff like that. But when I made the other painting, I started thinking more about, besides like how the sculpture looked, but like what like it sort of like meant to me, you know what I mean? And I did this painting of my mom like on the porch, and I just started thinking about like how like she was always sort of like concerned, or not concerned, but I feel like a lot of things she did was like based on like making sure I was okay and like make sure I was protected. So I would start thinking about how like I felt like sex and violence and stuff like that sort of like influenced her thoughts, you know what I mean? And like a lot of decisions she made. And so I wanted to give like a physical form to that. So that's where those like seekers first came in. And like as like time went on, like it sort of, I got further away from the sculpture, but it sort of like started with like this sculpture.
My name is Paul Stephen Benjamin, based in Atlanta, Georgia, originally from Chicago, Illinois. Currently, I am here exhibiting a work titled God Bless America that features Aretha Franklin and Lil Wayne. In this installation, God Bless America, it incorporates different aspects of my practice. My practice also includes large-scale paintings in which I use different colors of commercially purchased paints. In this instance, we're using Rich Black by Deluxe. The color black and the titles become very important. So in this instance, Rich Black. When it's taken out of context and you just have the words, that is important to me, that the sound of Aretha's voice is very rich. Lil Wayne has this rich, like lower tone within that's happening that is kind of, for me, creating this bass line within in the sound. But the sound itself is really they become mantras, they become these mesmerizing effects that can linger as you stay in there. And it's really about the vibration and being in the space and hearing the collection of sounds, but also seeing the red and blue lights that are pulsating with the sound. So when I think about vibration and in relationship to time, and if we were to look at Aretha Franklin, 1977, which I was a young kid, and Lil Wayne, an older man, 2013, this pulsation is very similar to me. The vibration, the movement of time and space, where in one sense, through this song, you look at Aretha with this euphoric pride, singing a song that you can tell she really felt, she believed in. Whether it was this American dream, whether it was the progression of the civil rights movement and, maybe even her own personal successes that, the descendant of slaves could be singing at a presidential inauguration. That was a significant moment. But then you fast forward to 2013 and Lil Wayne's version, in which he's singing this song. The relationship and that I guess the Black experience has been filtrated through that whole time period. So that vibration is that movement of time. It's also the collapsing of time and space, or the compression of it, in which all those things merge. And even though we're talking, what is that, like almost 40 years, has anything really changed? Because the spirit in which Lil Wayne is performing is much different. It has a different purpose, it has a different reasoning. And I'm interested in that without having to tell anybody that, for me, the representation of the two tell a large story, that the viewer has the opportunity to fill in that space. It's either history or your story, which is very important to me.